right, hello everybody. My name is Liana Mafouch. I am the playwright, producer, and performer of Blood of Our Soil. Co-producer, I should say. Thank you so much for joining us this evening at this important pre-show panel discussion. We're so honored to have you here, and we're honored to have our guests, our panelists, to engage in this important dialogue, which will hopefully contextualize the content of the play and be an entry point in a different way to what you're about to experience in the play if you're attending the performance. It's my honor to welcome moderator Alexander Hichi, president of UCC National, 2014 combat veteran Dmytro Lavrenchuk. Dmytro inspires in the content of the play and helped us to understand Ukraine's situation deeper. We're honored to have Frank Sisson, president of Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, Toronto, and associate professor at Western University, Magda Dichok. I will leave the rest of the discussion to our moderator, wonderful moderator. I will probably have to slip away around 7 o'clock so I can go prepare for the play. And so don't mind me as I slip away, and thank you very much for joining us again.
Good evening, dobry вечір, welcome, вітаємо. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces here in the audience this evening. We'll be spending the next hour together contextualizing what we will see shortly on the stage. So thank you very much to Liana for inviting me here to moderate. What many of you may not know is that Liana and I share two homelands. Two adopted homelands. One is, of course, Ukraine, and the second one is Kawaja Beach on the sandy shores of Georgian Bay, where her mother and I spent many carefree summers. And I remember Liana first as a toddler and then a beautiful young woman. Now, to the context. So most of you here know that in 1991, following a referendum in which over 90% of the population voted in the affirmative, Ukraine proclaimed its independence from the Soviet Union. But Ukraine's path to democracy has been a rocky one. Following the Orange Revolution in 2004 and the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Ukraine has now been at war with Russia for 5 years. In the summer of 2018, I accompanied Canada's Minister of International Development on her first visit to Ukraine. And on that visit, we traveled to the Mayorsk checkpoint in Donetsk Oblast, which is on the line of contact with the war with Russia. And we saw the damage that has been wrought by that war and the people who live in the midst of it. I know that this evening, after this evening's performance, you will better understand and forever remember those people. So none of us here have seen the performance yet, but we know from promotional material that we will see the struggles of the Ukrainian people against the atrocities of both Hitler and Stalin and the disturbing parallels to the current Putin regime. This evening's speakers will help us put the current events into historical context so that those of you who may not be familiar with Ukrainian history can understand the performance better. So allow me to more fulsomely introduce our discussants. Professor Frank Sisson is a graduate of Princeton, the University of London, and Harvard University. He has taught at Harvard and was an associate director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. He was appointed the first director of the Petro Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, known to most of us as KIUS, and has served as the editor-in-chief of the Hrushevsky Translation Project, which is preparing and publishing an English-language translation of Mikhailo Hrushevsky's 10-volume History of Ukraine. He served as acting director of KIUS and currently serves as the head of its Toronto office He is actively engaged in the development of the Ukrainian Studies program at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University in New York, as well as at the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. Professor Sisson will set the historical context, answering the question, how did we get here? What's been happening over the last 100 years or so? In 5 minutes or less.
5 minutes or less. Okay. Yes. Yes. History gets ever more condensed that is not current events. But first I should start from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, where I for many years had the privilege of working alongside Liliana's uncle, Andriy Makhuk, a esteemed scholar, specialist of Canadian Ukrainian history, a specialist of the Holodomor, and generally a great guy, whom we lost very recently, and in fact on Monday night, many of us will be gathering to remember Andriy. I bring this up because one day Andriy came into my office and said, well, I'm translating my mother's memoirs from the war, and Frank, don't you have something to do with this Shanetz place? And I said, you mean the village my grandfather came from? Yeah, I have something to do, and I've been there. And then picked up the diary and found out that Pani Hnat, I guess as she was at that point, was in Shanetz in 1944, as many people in Ukraine were making a crucial decision. That is, how far would the Soviet army reach? What should they do? These are the Carpathian Mountains, where many people were there deciding, were they going to cross over onto what was the Slovak side or not? It was a major escape route. And of all things, two people who were in that village, and in the case of my family more, my uncle, who was the Vit, made a decision not to leave, and not to leave his family. And before the end of the year, he and his son and his brother had all been killed by the Soviets. Fortunately, Liliana's Baba made the decision to go on. That is, to go on to an unknown world, and they knew not where it would end. We know how the war ended, but they had no idea at that point. And eventually, of course, to begin a route that would take her to Canada, and from that we see the Makhuk family and their development. So that's the one way in which I was tied in on a historical event that is, I think, crucial to the play we will be seeing tonight. That is war, the decisions made for war, and in fact, in the case of my family, many of them later were deported and wound up in Donetsk Oblast, and are now living through another war. They're grandchildren of those very people whose grandfathers were killed either for being in UPA or for being of the wrong political stripe, and now have found themselves on another front. Now the question is, how are we going to approach what is, at the moment, a Russian-Ukrainian war and a conflict that people didn't see coming? Certainly the European community did not see it coming. Many of the think tanks couldn't believe it would happen, and indeed many people in Ukraine and Russia thought that it could never come. So I have a way for you who want to look at this and understand this better to go out immediately and get Timothy Snyder's new book, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America. Please note that that title does not include the word Ukraine, but Ukraine is central to that book. Much of that book is about Ukraine and the Ukrainian events. It is at the moment one of the 5 books being considered for the Gelber Prize, which will be given at the Munk Center in another month. But for all of you, the prize of why you should get that book is it shows how the processes that began in certain political circles in Russia, and in this case he ties this into a man named Ilyin and the Russian emigration, reject the West reject liberal democracy, and ultimately have a tremendous impact on what becomes Putin's Russia. And within that discussion, he points out that the remark we all know by Putin by now, that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. One wondered of what he thought the 20th century was, if this was the greatest tragedy. Really, in many ways, was centered on Ukraine. The inability of certain elements of the Russian elite to accept that Ukrainians were a people and culture of their own, and above all, that Ukraine could be an independent state. After all, they whispered to Bush and others that it's really not a country and really doesn't belong. That is, what was missed by many people in the West with the breakup of the Soviet Union was that there were many deeper problems. And those deeper historical problems went to the basis of Russian-Ukrainian relations, and ultimately could then turn, when Russia turned away from democracy, when the KGB took over Russia, to a confrontation. And what Europe didn't seem to realize a few years ago, that the line of European civilization and a certain Eurasian civilization that rejected many of the values of liberal democracy ran down the Ukrainian-Russian border, and that this was then essential for the future of Europe. And out of that came all of the events associated with the Maidan. That is, when Ukrainians went in hundreds of thousands out to wave the European flag, many in the West viewed it as an interesting curiosity. They didn't understand that it was really a basic line of events. And if you turn to Snyder's book, you will see how he takes, and through such figures as Manafort and others, how he takes those events from what goes on in Ukraine to what eventually is going to influence American politics, so that then that Russian line now runs down the Potomac River, where it has tremendous influence. And what was originally Ukraine's problem has become an international problem.
Thank you, Professor Sisson. Spoken like a true teacher. You've just been given your first reading assignment. Professor Marta Dyczok is a graduate of the University of Toronto, University of London, and Oxford. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science with a joint appointment in the Department of History at the University of Western Ontario, and she traveled here today with a broken arm by bus. So that's true dedication.
I can't drive.
Professor Dyczok specializes in international politics and history with a focus on East Central Europe and Eurasia, and specifically Ukraine. Her research interests focus on the politics of history, mass media, migration, post-communism, and World War II. And when she isn't teaching, Professor Dyczok hosts an English language radio program, Ukraine Calling, on Hromadske Radio in Ukraine.
Thank you. I don't know if you'll be able to hear me if I sit, so I'm taking my colleague's advice to stand here. So if you can't hear me, give a wave and I'll speak a little louder. I'm actually delighted to be here, Liana. Thank you so much for the invitation. When I saw this play advertised, I thought, wow, somebody has created a play that reflects my research interests. Because my PhD was about World War II Ukrainian refugees. And my current research is about people who've been displaced during the current war in Ukraine. And it looks like this play brings together these two topics. And the reason I have been studying migration is because a lot of people, when we look at war, we look at the big picture. The Stalins and the Hitlers and the Putins, and how this is affecting geopolitics. But war has a really powerful impact on people. And that's the aspect that interests me. I grew up in a family of refugee parents. My parents were displaced during World War II, as I think many people either were displaced or grew up in these families. And you see how war is a long-term impact. And it's not just about how borders shift, it's about how people change. And how the scars stay with you for a very long time. Now, during the Second World War, that was the largest displacement of people in history. There were over 60 million people who were displaced. And of them, there were about 5 million who were Ukrainians. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to read my thesis, which has been published, the key finding there is that Ukrainians who were displaced at that time played a key role in redefining what a refugee is. Because those who didn't get repatriated to the Soviet Union, who chose to stay in the West, they had to make an argument of why the international community should not send them back to where they came from. And their argument was, well, because I have no homeland to go to. And they would say, well, what's your citizenship? And the answer would be, I'm Ukrainian. And there is no Ukraine, so they didn't know what to do with these people. And by insisting on their identity as Ukrainians, that contributed to the changing of the definition of what a refugee is. Because previously, refugees were defined by their citizenship. And after World War II, the new definition becomes an individual one. So a refugee becomes a person fleeing persecution or fear of persecution. So that was what my thesis was about. But there's now people, again, being displaced in Ukraine. And like Frank said, nobody expected this to happen. And so once again, the trauma is affecting millions of people. And we don't actually know how many people have been displaced by the war that Russia's perpetrating against Ukraine. We have official statistics. The Ukrainian government counts people. The international community has a representation there. UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, has a mission in Ukraine, and their estimates are that there is about 1,800,000 people who've been displaced internally by the war. That statistic is inaccurate because that statistic reflects only the people who has formally registered as being internally displaced. And in the research that I've been conducting, about a third of the people who have been displaced, they don't register. And it's not because they're afraid to register, but people register for different reasons, mainly to get social assistance. Because the government and international agencies, they provide assistance to people who've been displaced to find housing, various subsidies. And when I ask people who haven't registered, why didn't you? And they say, well, I'm healthy, I can work. And so I don't need to take money from the government. We don't actually know what the picture is now because the big flow of migration pretty much ended in 2015. Because right now what we're seeing in the East is not quite trench warfare, but it's that kind of, they're shooting at each other and every day there's killing and people being wounded, but there aren't big territorial shifts happening. So the big wave of migration has ended. The way this wave of migration is different is people are internally displaced. They're not going into the mountains and deciding whether they're leaving. They're resettling within Ukraine primarily, which has interesting consequences both for Ukraine and these individuals because they're resettling in different parts of the country. And often they're discovering a part of Ukraine that they've never seen because people in Ukraine don't travel as much as we do. So very often this is the first time somebody from Luhansk has ended up in Cherkasy or Lviv or somewhere. So this is kind of a new experience, and the reception of these people is kind of mixed. And there are even examples of people returning back to where they came from because they couldn't find a job, they couldn't find a sort of an adequate place to live. And after having stayed for a few months, they just ended up going back. But that is not what the play is about. The play is about, I think, larger issues of displacement and how individuals are affected by it. And I could keep talking for a long time, but I know we have another panelist and we want more discussion, so thank you very much. I can't wait to see the play. And if you have any more questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dichok, and I know that we as Canadians should be proud that Canada is contributing along with other members of the international community. You've mentioned the United Nations Human
High
Rights
Commissioner for Refugees.
Yeah, and the International Red Cross and other European countries are doing a lot to assist with housing and just basic sustenance in that gray zone along the line of contact there. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our guest from Ukraine, Vitaємо. Dmytro Lavrenchuk was an active participant in the Maidan, in the Revolution of Dignity. He's a veteran of the war in eastern Ukraine. He served in the Aidar Battalion in 2014 and was wounded in battle. He is now a facilitator, moderator, activist, and mentor of a number of social projects. He's an active member of the Society of Veterans of the Anti-Terrorist Operation in eastern Ukraine. Dima will describe the events on the Maidan as he saw them and what drove him to volunteer after the Maidan on the front and what his return to civilian life has been like since then. Proszę.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, you're here. Thank you, Patrick and Liana, for inviting me. I just went there someday. I was skeptical, just skeptical about what was happening there in the central square, skeptical about Mustafa Nayyem's action, about his night standing on Maidan. Remember, it came from his call to people, come to me, we have tea, we will talk. So I wasn't there that night. It was after the already students were beaten when I actively engaged, just get there, talk to people. I was working, so I had no time to be there, but after the events, after I talked to people and realized that it's not a political trick, yeah, because everybody in Ukraine, you must understand that fear to be played, fear to be a chess statue, taken advantage of, probably. Manipulated, that's right. So, but after I've talked to people that were in Maidan and they were getting more and more, I've realized that this is the people these are the people who want to change something in this country. They're tired of the old system, ineffective and unproductive, counterproductive system that have no dignity and have no human face, right? And that was the time that I realized I want to be with the people, to talk to them, to know how we can change that. Before I was not active socially, but after that I became more and more involved in the events. So and in some moment I needed already to quit the job to be there actively, to participate actively, to be productive there, right? It was not only about standing on Maidan. It was also about thinking of it was like cultural boom when people thinking of some projects, installations, performances that can show to government that we are not agree with you. So and after the Yanukovych didn't sign the agreement with European Union, we understood that it is not our leader at all. Like we understood it before. Yanukovych was not a good president for most of people. He was not our president. So it was legitimate trigger to just go to the streets and show the constitutional right to not being agreed with government. So and in that events, after all that events you know about, right? I won't tell many about that, but I can tell that we had only 1 week of happiness in that whole period till now, when Yanukovych gun flew, and before Putin aggressed territory of Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So it was 1 week of happiness. We just thought that it's over, but it was not over. On Maidan we also thought of some resistance, and we needed to prepare ourselves for active resistance. So we got into a group to work with tactics, to know how to move in groups, because we thought that some brutal activists from other side can bring the conflicts to our cities. So we were preparing to defend our cities. And after we saw army is not doing anything, they're just waiting for commands, and commands are not being delivered, right? We realized that, as on Maidan, we need to push this hole by ourselves. So we went just to east, hoping we will find some other guys like us that want to, just without an unofficial thing, just to have a gun and to stand in front of people who want to aggress our country, and to show that we won't let them do that. So it was just unofficial, unsubscribed in any army units. Just we were together from Maidan with our unit, squad, group of people, like 20-25 people. We were named already after like squad, Bob Marley's squad, National Rebel or Popular Rebel, Bob Marley squad. So, and that's how we got into Aidar, where on the east we just moved there. Before I with my friend get there on a reconnaissance investigation whether it suit us, because army, first we came to army unit brigade, but they say you must apply to military commissariats, like military recruit units in your city, and that would meant that we need to go all around Ukraine within this, like Lviv. We have in our squad we have from Lviv, from Chernivtsi, from Sumy, from eastern Ukraine. So we would need to be separated, but we didn't want that because we were already trained to act together. So the sole resolution for that, it was just to go unofficial, to volunteer on the front, because it was all about connection to somebody you can trust. And it saved a lot of us because of that connection, because we treated each other as brothers and sisters, because we were close enough. In army, you frequently you can't have such connection. I'm very pleased to have my friend, my brother in arm, Petro Sichko, who was with me when I was wounded, and he was delivering me to a helicopter. He was doing all the best he can to rescue me, and because of him, maybe I'm standing here now and talking to you.
So, as Professor Sisson said, Ukraine is now everyone's problem. Perhaps you can speak to what the invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine means for Canadians, Ukrainian Canadians living here, and the larger global community?
Yes, what does it mean? And it means very different things to all of them. I think when I think of the Ukrainian Canadian community, I think it changed our community. And we saw this happen twice with the two revolutions, when suddenly it didn't make any difference what language someone spoke who came to the demonstrations. We have never been so surrounded by Russian speakers as we were in the demonstrations that were held in front of the Russian embassy. So I think in a certain degree, it brought together what we'll call the fourth wave or whatever wave of our community and the more traditional Ukrainian community. That is, it gave a common cause, and I think that was of extreme importance. The second is the ability of the Ukrainian Canadian community to have a voice on the Canadian government. Well, now, of course, we've got one of the best voices, and
Inside the government.
Chrystia Freeland was my student many years ago, I might add, so I'm particularly pleased to see that. But obviously, at a point when I think many of us had thought that the best days of the Ukrainian Canadian community were over, that is, the days when there were so many prominent Ukrainian Canadians, and from the Supreme Court to the premiers of various provinces, it looked like we were a declining group and not going to have the impact of all the new groups that arrived. And this, I think, brought back the Ukrainian Canadian community throughout the country into those activities. And then the fact that Canada could have a voice. I don't know the inner workings of politics between Washington and Ottawa, but it is at least my impression there were times when Washington was using Ottawa as a stalking horse, or at least going forward in events that Washington didn't want to do. And certainly Europe paid attention to Canada at that time. So those are all the events right after the Maidan and as the war began. Where do we stand this many years after? So I think on the one hand, in my view, one of the great and maybe at times unsung heroes, remember when we were calling Angela Merkel, Frau Ribbentrop and other such things? I think we all underestimated the importance of her activity and bringing Germany and then bringing all of Europe at least onto line on the sanctions, which was crucial. They have held to a remarkable degree despite all the other changes that have gone on, but it did galvanize Europe at a time, and it did draw attention to Ukraine throughout Europe. And now we say, but is it now forgotten? How much is it forgotten? So it isn't, in a way, it is forgotten because the world has gotten itself into so many other problems. Who could have imagined, we would be in the situation we are today with the political entities? Until recently, Canada looked like this little island of quiet tranquility as opposed to what was going on everywhere else. So I think in that sense, it is almost inevitable. And then, of course, the economic ties, the northern streams, all the things that make Ukraine recede. But the other is the hope for Ukraine, the hope that Ukraine would reform at a rapid pace and would become a model. And therefore I leave to people from Ukraine to talk more about that. But of course there are the disillusionment of what changes could be. And we have many explanations. We have a war, we have how that society could operate, but there are certain problems with it. The only thing that I would say is that although Ukraine muddles along, although Ukraine sometimes looks like it's going to sink into a morass, compared to the horror that's going on east of the Ukrainian border, and the horror that's going on in the so-called republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, it still means that Ukraine does stand for something. Will it stand for Europe and stand for NATO when we can no longer get the man in Washington to stand for NATO and Europe is a much harder problem to deal with today. But in many ways, Ukrainians are still showing that there is some general liberal, democratic, and I would say European values that are worth supporting, and in that way a model on it.
So, Professor Sisson, you also said that in Putin's view, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the tragedy to befall the 20th century. Are there indications that Putin has been planning the invasion of Ukraine for a much longer time, and what is his end game?
Putin has been acting to reestablish hegemony in the former Soviet space. And we saw the first invasion in Georgia. Ukraine is just part of the larger picture. To what degree he will succeed is to be seen. The larger end game is to destabilize the Western liberal democratic order. So there's a number of things going on. What's going on regionally and what's going on internationally. And in many ways, I think Ukraine is fascinating for the world because it's in some ways, it's like a testing lab, right? For something like information warfare. Everybody now knows what information warfare is because they're on the receiving end of it. But Ukraine was on the receiving end first. And Yevhen Fedchenko, who's the Dean of Journalism at Cave Mohila, gave me a great interview. If you don't listen to my radio show, you should. It comes on a podcast. And 2 years ago, 3 years ago, he said Ukraine was the testing lab for Russia's information warfare. They practiced, they perfected the techniques, and now they're being used internationally. And I think with a lot of things like that, Ukraine has multiple layers of influence, importance, influence. So Putin's interested in the regional hegemony, but he's also using Ukraine to test how far he can go to push other things as well.
So here's something that we're going to take a vote on at the end of this question. The audience will get to vote. So Putin has been compared to both Stalin and Mussolini. And Madeleine Albright recently wrote, "Anti-democratic leaders are winning democratic elections, and some of the world's savviest politicians are moving closer to tyranny with each passing year. Russian President Vladimir Putin isn't a full-blown fascist, but he has flipped through Stalin's copy of the totalitarian playbook and underlined passages of interest to call on when convenient. Mussolini's political strategy, she notes, was to pluck a chicken one feather at a time, so that each squawk will be heard separately and the whole process is kept as quiet as possible." So, who is Putin more like, Hitler or Mussolini? First, our discussants.
Well, Stalin also used salami tactics in Eastern Europe, slicing one piece of salami. That's Rakushi's famous. I mean, that's a tactic that a lot of totalitarian leaders use. I think that's a very common comparison, but I would put Putin in a category by himself. I don't think he's either following one or the other. He's learning from all sorts of previous authoritarian, totalitarian leaders. And he's taking things to a new level. We should never underestimate him. He's extremely smart. He's extremely ruthless. The man has no conscience. And he's got a big apparatus. And he's drawing information and tactics from everywhere. And he's spinning them so that we're constantly playing catch up. So he's always coming up with new ideas. So I think historical context is useful. But I think we really need to study Putin for who he is. And there are people who are looking into his past and saying, is he the KGB operative? Or is he the history man? Because he likes to play historical cards, the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he also, Novorossiya, and he's constantly referring to history. So that's a really good tactic. But he's, at the heart, he's all about money. right? If you think about it, he's like, some people say he's really just the free marketeer. He's using ideology and all this sort of geopolitical, we need to restore Russia's greatness to make money, right? That's where he's really at. So there's a lot of different angles, because Stalin wasn't about money, but Putin is. So I think we really want to look at him, at what he's doing, and to the end of how do you stop this? Because nobody's talking about that enough. It's like, what's he doing? But he has to be stopped.
Yeah.
And this is something that at the end of World War II, the Alliance was thinking, how do we stop Hitler? And I don't hear enough people talking about how to stop Putin. I mean, sanctions, yes. But that's not stopping him. And there's a talk at the Kennan Institute, how Russia's surviving the sanctions, because they are. And we see Merkel, she's now being photographed with Lavrov smiling. So let's keep a very clear head of what is happening and what could still be happening.
Yeah, I think we hear more about appeasement than stopping him.
Yeah.
Professor Sisson, how do you vote?
So it makes Mussolini look pretty good. That is, I think if we would look at how this structure would work, and when Madeleine Albright says, well, it's not quite fascism, so this was a way, I think, of somewhat mitigating, but I don't think it really works that way. That is, the fascists like Mussolini were trying to really engage a populace behind them for some sort of, however crazed goal or ideal that they had. And in a certain way had a certain loyalty to their country, however misplaced it is. And I think Putin doesn't have those. On the other hand, he has a desire to attack a certain kind of civilization. So there are various numbers of layers of Putin. And in this, I'm not fully convinced of that money is the only thing.
No, I didn't say the only thing. I said, but it is important.
So what I would say on the one hand, there is this remnant of Russia and its place in the world and this revanchism, which is what created, after all, Nazi Germany and in some ways Italy and much of interwar Europe. So there is a revanchism of replacing that civilization where it is, but substantially changing that civilization. And if you all run out and buy that Snyder book, and you will see some of the ideological underpinnings of Putin, and you will see that there is an ideology that's behind it, and it regrettably is the most odious part of Russian culture. There are many fine parts of Russian culture, but what he's chosen to draw from is not. There is, on the other hand, this world now conflict in which he wants a multipolar world, and the particular hatred of the United States, and after all, he's managed to bring the U.S. to its knees. So it's been amazing what he's been able to do. And then the final part is there is our specific particular issue, the desire not to accept Ukraine as existing. And in here, I would argue it is not only, often it was said that Russian liberalism always ends at the point of Ukrainian independence, but there is also a biological demographic element of this whole game he is playing. Has anyone looked lately at the increase of the Muslim population within Russia? And if they don't reintegrate Ukraine in, Russia is going to be fairly soon more people in mosques than in churches, certainly, and certainly a very different civilization. So on that sense, there is this particular animus hatred of Ukraine that is a quite specific element of what are some other grand policies.
Which is why maybe the Tomos was so painful for Putin, but that's a whole other topic. So the final word on this question to Dmytro, then I'm going to take a vote and turn the questions over to our audience.
I just, before our panel discussion, I asked on Facebook this same question about Putin, whether he looks like Mussolini or a Hitler. So, and most of people said that it's not a real question. It's marketing, empty marketing comparisons. That is nothing to do with the question how he need to be stopped. right? It's what you've said, and most people are also like. One guy who is working on book on Mussolini said that he's not resembling at all. Mostly, he can be described as Bismarck more than Mussolini. So, and he said that he tries to unite not with an ideology, but with a shared market, as it was with custom unity.
It's all,
Custom unity.
custom union. Custom
Union.
yeah.
Custom union. So there is Bismarck also, but still, I think, as already was said, that he needs to be analyzed by himself, because firstly we made him too much honor to be compared also with such historical characters. So basically, but also we need to be attentive with such enemy.
So, questions from the audience?
With the upcoming U.S. elections in a couple of years, do you see any potential candidate on the horizon on the Democrat side that could turn things around in terms of U.S. foreign policy against Russia and strengthening the NATO alliance?
Yeah, I mean, we have such a kaleidoscope of candidates at the moment to look at. It's very hard to see this. But I think you hit I think this very important issue, which is the Democratic Party's weakness on foreign policy. And that is the most stunning thing that strikes me. I will admit, not always popular among my Canadian friends, I was a Reagan voter when I was back in the U.S., and I was willing to do this believing.
Confessions or Professor
But these confessions are the confessions of what was an important period, but the Republican Party stood for something, and it no longer does. The Democrats went into total tailspin on much of their foreign policy, and they have been unable to come out of it. And of course, Obama, was one of his greatest failings. The only thing that I would say out of it is that the Russians, on the one hand, have pushed and Putin their back to the wall. Trump's lunacy with China and what he's doing on is going to push something else, and there's going to have to come then some more reasonable way. Now, the only hope is that will NATO hold long enough before we lose what is, after all, the real anchor of our world, and we are in danger of losing it at the moment. And so I am not very hopeful looking at the candidates at the moment. I still get to vote in the U.S. because I'm a dual citizen, so I do vote for the presidential elections, and I'm hoping there'll be a way to vote. And of course, the great tragedy was that Hillary Clinton did not win. Someone who had a concept of foreign policy, understood what Russia was, and we can all regret that. And we have many of our Ukrainian Americans who paraded along and went for Trump out of some absolute insanity, when it was clear that at least with Hillary Clinton you would have had someone with some foreign policy.
Many a Christmas has been ruined by that dichotomy in the Ukrainian American community.
Yeah. But they also managed to wreck the world with their idiocy on this one. Yeah.
Marta, do you want to weigh in on that?
I'm not an expert on American politics.
Okay, we'll take another question from the audience.
So Canada is held in the world as sort of a model federated state, and I'm not sure how this is still going to play out with all the separatism we still have, looking at Alberta even these days. But Canada is still held up as a model of a federation. The Soviet Union was supposed to, in its idealism, to be a federated state with all the different nationalities, and yet the greatest tragedy of the 20th century happened. It fell apart. Is that because of can you analyze why that happened? Is that Russian chauvinism, pure and simple, killed the Federation of Soviet Socialist Republics?
The Soviet Union was a federation in name only. You know, the Soviet Union was a federation in name only. It was set up as a federation, but it was a highly centralized state that was controlled by the Kremlin. And it collapsed for a number of reasons. and economic, political, national, international. So it wasn't, I mean, Russia, if you look back at 1990, Russia was interested in weakening the power of the center. And Boris Yeltsin was fighting with Gorbachev over power. And Russia declared independence from the Soviet Union. So we forget all this stuff, right? But it wasn't a real federation. And there are very few functioning federations. Yugoslavia was a more functioning federation. It also fell apart. I think Switzerland is probably one of the few. I mean, Canada's a federal state.
Australia.
Australia.
Maybe.
So there
And American
are
Federation.
functioning federal states and there are sort of mythical states. And the Soviet Union was not a federation. So that's...
But it was also the symbol of what was going to come later. That is, that you could have sham democratic institutions and sham elections. Soviet Union pioneered a sham federation. Of course, there still is the Russian Federation, is the official name of the state, which is
So-
another sham as well on it. And the only thing I will point out is that I don't know if Canada is the model of a federation. Isn't it said that the Canadian constitutional structure is really like the structure of a bumblebee? It shouldn't fly, but it does. And a certain way, the Canadian way of backing into a federation leaves us, with a rather strange structure that is hard to conceive of how it would work anywhere else, except if you ignore lots of things. Asymmetrical federalism and all we have had on this. I think that the only other issue I would say is the issue that everyone has tried to push, Ukrainian federalism, right? And this is going to come up now as a major issue and come up with what they're going to try and do with Donbass. They're going to try and create then an unworkable federation for Ukraine.
That comes from Putin also. From
Yeah, and it
Medvedchuk.
comes from Putin. But it'll have all kinds of resonance in places like Germany and things that these federalism should be good.
Yeah, it's an issue too. Still, I wanted to point that we were discussing mostly like Putin, like someone, mostly Putin, unfortunately. But we have our Ukraine. I'm just thinking that if we think about someone else that is in charge of our weakness, we are giving the chance of resolving the conflict for ourselves. So first thing, we've not talked about any Ukrainian politician even. Yeah, it's
We can.
it's elections soon. We have some issues also about elections, but still, and politicians are also not the key persons, right? We have people who just voluntarily as an everyday job, but not paid, trying to make better its country. We have plenty of people who are still defending country without any official вызнання, recognition. Yeah. And that are people who are most active in Ukraine, that can change Ukraine, because also many people tired of the war, but still they are even not were the part of it and not even trying to be. We have different issues on our own in Ukraine. That is nothing to do with Russia, but Russia exploits these weaknesses of Ukraine for sure. But if we will think about the reasons, причины, reasons of that situation, we can find that we can reestablish for our own the reasons, and that will give us a chance to win, right? To overstand Russia, because as a thing, you had a question about what the West can do for Ukraine, right? To understand, I would better to say what Ukraine can do for West, that will help the West to understand the policy of Russia. Because West is not so interested in that kind of tricks of Russia, because somehow Russia is making business with all world, right? And many people don't want to realize some things that can bring our civilized world down. But still, it's the work that Ukraine must do for the world, to point at the tricks that Russia make.
Let's flip it around, and what does Putin think about Ukraine? 5 years later, he did not expect Ukraine to resist the way it has. And my friend Brian Whitmore says Ukraine has basically fought Russia to a draw. And nobody, including Ukraine, would have expected this, right? He took over Crimea, and I think his expectation was Donbass and maybe more. And this resistance happens, which is continuing, which I think is baffling him and making him crazy, because he can't win, right? He's not losing, but he can't win. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. And what you just said about who can learn what from whom, there's a presidential election going on, and because I also study media, I'm following what all the candidates are saying. And of course, they're all saying great things about themselves. But Poroshenko gave an interview. He was on ICTV on a live talk show, and he made this really interesting point about Ukraine and NATO. And you're right, Frank. NATO is in a really tenuous situation right now, but it's still alive and kicking. But Poroshenko said Ukraine is looking to join NATO, but what's in fact happening is NATO is now looking to Ukraine to learn, because NATO trainers are going to help Ukrainians learn certain types of things. But Ukrainians have learned how to fight this kind of war that NATO wants to learn how to do. So there's this exchange of knowledge happening, and the type of warfare that Ukrainians like you and the army, again, it sort of baffles the mind that.
It's true. I can only.
If you think of the big Russian war machine, and these little ragtag Ukrainians kind of get their act together, and so that expertise is being recognized by NATO. And David, you could probably speak more to that. And those of you who want to follow more, there's NATO in Ukraine they've become very active on social media lately, and our ambassador Roman Vostruk is talking about all the different things, but there's that learning that's mutual that I think is very, very interesting that's going on.
And I think that's something that all the Canadian troops that come back from Operation Unifier in Ukraine will say, that they have learned more from the Ukrainians than they have taught them, which maybe is an exaggeration, but I think it's at least a fair exchange in those. And just to your earlier point, I think if it wasn't for the volunteer battalions that stood the ground until the Ukrainian army, which really had been decimated by Yanukovych, could rally, but for those volunteers, we
don't know
would
what it
have
would
been in a
have.
much worse place. I want to welcome the parents of Liana, my good friend Sonia Marin and her father Nestor Makuch, my friends from much younger days. So last question from Sonia.
What distinctive points do you see between yourselves and older people, your parents' generation and your grandparents' generation, and in terms of the upcoming elections as well? Is there more support among the young for, let's say, a more democratically leaning candidate, or the tried and untrue?
Young generation want to change that, but it doesn't know how to make it. But just trying many options, we will find out the way, I think. Working hard, like many people, millennials are engaged in this reformation of Ukraine by volunteering and doing some great jobs, great projects in Ukraine. The problem still is mostly we doesn't know what to do exactly, but we need to establish that through within ourselves, right? And that is probably is the distinctive difference between young generation and the old, because younger generation is intuitively want to exchange the points of view, the networks, social networks. They want to work in the teams productively. The old generation more traditionalists, more conservatives. They doesn't want changes. They want their lives to be comfortable, but the comfort is not what we need now. Like, we can point to comfort and it can't be a goal now. I don't know if I'm asked to answer the question, because it's very difficult.
Professor Sisson, final word to you tonight.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is it's not entirely generational. I spend a huge amount of time watching these endless YouTube videos of the arguments over churches all over Ukraine at the moment. And in which you see what we would normally call these, prosti silski babchi, having arguments about tomoses and our rights and what are our constitutional rights and what do we have to vote. I have been very proud of them, particularly as they've dealt with a whole series of priests who are on another side of it. But what I would say out of it, it's like with the young people. Ukrainian society has changed. Ukrainian society in many ways is more sophisticated than some of the so-called Western societies, and particularly the society to the south of us at the moment, who seems to be able to be pulled around by the nose. And yet there is not the next structure upward that allows them then to take that change and that change in attitude, whether in the politics, where we haven't got the faintest idea what's going to happen with the presidential election. We don't know what's going to go with the party elections. We have just seen with the church what happened when this push and shove came, that you've got a society that's changed, but the institutions between that and the next stage that are going to create this are not all there. And so you've got to support the ones that do work. And of course, the volunteers are the ones we see that did work, at a crucial point in time.
Professor Sisson, I hope you're not planning on crossing that border anytime soon with those remarks that you made about our neighbor to the south.
Yeah, I'm going to use my Canadian passport when I go across that time.
I think that we can end this evening on a hopeful note. I think that Ukraine reached the tipping point during the Revolution of Dignity. It is holding its ground, and we are ever hopeful that this war will end, at least in our lifetimes. So,
Just if I can add
Yes?
one little tip about everything that is happening. Also about the question for what the West can do. The thing that the guys did the show and making awareness, it's already the thing that can be done for Ukraine. To make awareness, to understand that, to make it understandable for Western people. To its connections, and its unofficial connections, but as you said about volunteers, the volunteers is unofficial apparatus, mechanism that is good in Ukrainian blood. Unofficial connections that can make some things be done as projects. It's democratized country, and I'm very happy to be a part of your show and that you invited me. Thank you very much.
Dmytro, you've provided the... Segue for me to thank our guests, Professor Sisson, Professor Dechok, and Dmytro Lovrenchuk. Let's all go and enjoy the show.
Here, here. Are you coming to see the play?